Hi, everybody. I'm really excited today to host Tina Payne Bryson. She will introduce herself in 1 second. And before she does, for those of you who don't already know me, I'm Valerie Groisman. I'm a registered social worker based in Ontario, and I help families with their little ones, including their sleep. And today I'm really excited to have Tina talk all about sleep and sleep training, and also all the things all around it. But first, Tina, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I am a mom to 3 boys who are now teenagers and young adults, but I am a social worker also. That's my background. I have a background in education, and I do some child development, school counseling kind of stuff on a really small basis at a school locally. I write books. I've written books with Dr. Dan Siegel that some of you may know, The Whole Brain Child and No Drama Discipline, The Yes Brain, and our last book together, The Power of Showing Up, which is really all about attachment. I still am sort of like in the honeymoon phase with that book because it just came out in January. So 2 books coming out this year, because I've got another one coming out September 1st called The Bottom Line for Baby, and it's my first solo book. And I'm really excited about it because it's an A to Z guide. You just flip to whatever the topic is, like sleep training, and it lays out the competing arguments, what the science says, gives a bottom line for what you should do. And then in about half of the entries, I give a personal note too. I talk about one of my own stories or a story of a family I worked with or something like that. So, and then the other thing I do is that I founded and am the executive director of a place called the Center for Connection in Pasadena, California. And it's a clinical practice, so it's mental health, but it's also multidisciplinary. So occupational therapy, speech and language, neuropsychology, and educational therapy. So it's an interdisciplinary approach so that when kids and families are struggling, we can truly peel back the layers to find out what's going on and how to give them the best intervention. So that's a nutshell. That's enough. We can just talk about babies and parenting.
Yeah, so you've written multiple, co-written multiple best-selling books, and they're all about making sense of parenting, but also with understanding of attachment and relationships and the neurobiology behind them, and really staying close to the science while translating it to how do we apply it as parents and as people who support parents or raise babies.
Yeah.
It's really exciting that you're coming out with your own book. What inspired you to write your own book and to focus specifically on this topic?
You know, let me back up for 1 second and talk about why I wrote those other books with Dan. Excuse me. So I was a stay-at-home mom until my youngest went to kindergarten. I was a stay-at-home mom, but in that interim, I was teaching parenting classes when my husband was with the kids, and I got a PhD during that time. Like I went back to school because we discovered that we couldn't afford to live in California on one income, and so I was like, I don't want to work. I want to be home with the kids, but we needed me to, and so I thought, well, I'm going to be a professor so that I can be home with the kids, when they're old enough and to be in school, I'll be in the same hours. So that was the plan. But what happened is I was studying all this stuff about childbearing and childbearing theory. And I was also studying with Dan Siegel, interpersonal neurobiology. And I had these little ones at home, and I was taking the science I was learning, and I was like, oh my gosh, he's having a right brain tsunami right now. He can't understand logical left. And I was like, parents need to know this. So really from the very beginning, all the books I wrote were really about taking the science that was helpful and practical and allowed us to be more in tune with ourselves and with our kids and to share that with parents and educators. So that's really where all the books with Dan have come from. But this book, this was the book I wanted. I know as a parent and as just a person, I feel safer and more grounded in any kind of like fear or unknown or whatever when I have information. And so I'm one of those people who likes to search and gather the information. And what happened is that when I had a baby, and I was living in rural Texas at the time, away from family, there were no lactation specialists, there were no child development people around me, and the internet was around, thank goodness. So I would search, and everything I came up with contradicted each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed like sound sources. So I was really lost. I felt really untethered. Like, okay, well, that made sense, but that made sense. What do I do? So this is the book that I needed and wanted. And so I just really feel as parents that when we're informed, when we know what the science says, it's a good starting place. It's not the end spot, because we have to take that. We have to think about our own values and beliefs and what works for our family, and really trust our instincts. But most importantly is to know our babies and our children and follow their lead to some degree. What works well for one is not helpful at all for the other. So I really wanted to give this book almost as a gift to new parents, to say, okay, here, you're so busy, you're so tired, here's the information, you can skim it in really quick form on whatever decision you have to make, and then go be with your baby and figure it out together. So that's the inspiration for this book.
Yes, and it's absolutely essential. There's so much information out there, and I think even a hard time tuning into intuition and a focus on the science, but sometimes we forget how to translate and how to apply it in practice, and that's when I think those conflicts of guilt and shame might come up. So yeah, I can't say enough how excited I am about this.
Oh, thank you, Valerie. The other thing is that, I don't know about you guys, but I feel like everyone has an opinion about everything when it comes to your child. Everyone is like, you have to do this or you have to do this. And, I think too, especially when it's family members, like your mother or your mother-in-law or your, someone you're close to in your family, and they're like, no, we didn't do it that way. And so this is also a kind of a way, instead of telling them to like leave you the hell alone because it's your baby, to be like, oh, here, read this entry, you'll see that I'm right about this. So it's kind of a good way to deflect some of those well-meaning but intruding family members.
Absolutely. And sometimes we need a quick reference to the science from a reliable source. So something that I'm really excited about is that you know what you're talking about, and it can be trusted, and you don't need to keep looking. You can just go to this book and get your answers answered. And I think kind of the power of social workers is being able to collect all this information in a very objective way, so that you can take it and understand it the way that it applies to your baby, not how it applies to other people's babies, because that honestly doesn't matter, because it doesn't help you with yours, right?
Right.
Yeah, so I actually have a few questions for you from other parents, and I'm really excited about this myself because I have a 2-year-old and I went through all these questions too, and I'm really looking forward to hear your thoughts about this. So the first one is from parents who don't necessarily, or people who don't necessarily support sleep training. One of the things that they claim is that it can harm attachment. And so what are your thoughts about sleep training impacts on attachment?
Okay, can I just answer a little more globally and then shrink it in?
Very big question, yes.
It's a very big question. Okay, so here's the gist of what I talk about. And obviously I go into more detail in the book, but really when people are wondering about sleep training, there are 3 main questions that come up. The first one is, does it work? The second one is, will it hurt my baby? And the third one is that question, is it gonna harm my bond or my relationship between me and my baby? So do you want me to just answer the third one, or do you want me to answer all 3?
Why don't we answer all 3?
Okay. So I was telling Valerie right before we hit record that this was the hardest entry in the book, because I am dedicated in this book to really reporting what the science says as objectively as I can. Okay. And I don't follow and didn't follow all of the scientific recommendations in the book. For example, tummy time, like my pediatrician and what the science says is tummy time is good for kids. Tummy time was miserable for my kids. So I would try it for a minute and then I'd be like, forget it, and that's totally fine. I'm comfortable with that. So you don't have to follow what the science says. The science is a guide or a starting point, as I said, for you to then look at many other things. The other problem with research is that it's often done in a silo. So I'm going to talk about the sleep training research, and it was when people studied sleep training, but they're not looking at other fields of research. So I'm going to bring some of that in as well. In terms of the first question, and again, this was a really, really hard entry to write. I'll tell you the first thing that is interesting. People think there's a lot of good quality science out there on sleep training, but in fact, that's not really true. There are less than 15 high quality studies. Okay, so there's not a ton of science out there. That's a first starting place. So the verdict is not in, okay? But what the research shows is that, yes, it is effective. Oh, actually, before I go there, I should define what I mean by sleep training.
Yes.
That's super important.
Yes.
You were already thinking that. Okay, so most credible experts do not advocate for a full-on cry it out method. Really, I mean, these days, even Ferber changed his mind. Even Ferber came back and said, no more am I going to recommend that you kiss your awake baby goodnight, turn off the light, close the door, and then leave them in there till morning. Okay, so even the most, like Ferber was the radical guy that originally said, even if they vomit, just go in and change them and leave them back again. But he's softened on that and all kinds of other things, including co-sleeping. So most experts that are credible don't advocate for a full-on, just, harsh, close the door, close the light, and you're done. And so when we're talking about cry it out, let me say this too. Sleep training is a huge umbrella. So as a parent who didn't do any cry it out methods, and I'll just show my cards there before we get further in, I did not use any type of cry it out methods. And I don't regret that. I feel good about that decision, and I wouldn't do it if I had a baby now. But there are lots of ways that I did sleep training. For instance, when my newborns needed a diaper change in the middle of the night and I was nursing them, I kept all the lights really low and I didn't really talk to my baby very much. That is sleep training also. I'm training my child to sleep and to know when nighttime is. So I think when people say sleep training, they mean some version of cry it out, but I think we need to expand our definition of it and say, really anything we're doing, even if you nurse your baby to sleep and you slightly rouse them and then they fall asleep, wait, that is sleep training also. So for what we're talking about and the questions that are being asked here, what we're really talking about together, let's just get on the same definition, is some version of a cry it out method that's typically done at intervals. So after 3 minutes or after 5 minutes or after 10 minutes, and you progressively expand those intervals before you go back in to comfort your baby. There are lots of programs, lots of different plans, lots of approaches. Some of them say not to touch your baby, but just use your voice. Other ones say you can pat your baby, but don't pick them up. There are lots and lots of programs. But for our purposes, let's talk about some sort of interval where you're allowing your child to cry before you go back in to comfort and start the next interval. Okay, so that's how we're
You're not responding to their cry based on what you're hearing. You're responding based on how long you should be waiting.
That's right. That's a good way to say that. Okay, so does it work? The research says yes. Okay, but we have to put that in perspective because what the research found is that babies whose parents used some version of a cry it out interval training, they did sleep better. They had better sleep. And this was good for babies because babies who get better sleep are better able to learn and be more regulated. And so it was good for babies in that sense, in terms of being well rested. And in some cases in the science, it was better for parents because two things happened for parents when their babies were sleeping better. Parents were less depressed, so you had less incidence of depression, which, as you know, is really impactful on developing babies, and less marital conflict, probably because they weren't as tired, right? So they weren't as grumpy with each other. So in terms of that, it worked. But we have to keep in mind that this is never, and the science doesn't say that this is you do it once and it's fixed and you're good to go.
Which is something that is very much a message that gets sent, is you just need to do this once, just get through it for 3 days and everybody will be happy forever and sleeping.
And that's not what the science says either. The science says that babies are bad sleepers, that as babies get older, they become better sleepers. It also, by the way, and I don't want to forget this, most sleep experts who, and I guess I should say experts, because as you pointed out, sleep experts are not regulated. It's not a regulated industry. So, my electrician could decide that he wanted to be a sleep trainer and, whatever. But most experts don't recommend any form of cry it out sleep training until 4 to 6 months. So for sure, we're not talking about newborns. But what is interesting is that the science shows that this has to be repeated sometimes over and over. Anytime you travel or your baby gets sick or, there's some change, or they go through a developmental spurt where separation anxiety gets activated more because they have better cognition to understand that you're not there with them. So during different developmental phases, all the sleep training you did can get undone. And so you may have to do it again repeatedly. So it's not a one time and it's not a rip the Band-Aid off and now you're good kind of thing. For some babies, they train really fast and they stay good sleepers for a long time and maybe have slight disruptions. Other babies, it's over and over and over. And the science says that about 20% of babies, no matter what you do, no form of sleep training works. That's 1 out of 5 babies. So
a lot of babies, yeah.
A lot of babies, and that's a lot of crying. Okay, but as far as the research goes, if we're just giving a quick one-word answer, yes, it works. The second question, will it harm your baby? This is a tougher question, and the science is mixed on this, but primarily says that the longitudinal studies where they went back and looked at kids when they were ages 5 and 6, and they looked at them in terms of their behavior and their IQs and all of those things, the babies grew up to present as if there were no downsides to doing it. So as far as the body of literature says now, no, it's not going to harm children in terms of their outcomes. So if you are someone who has done cry it out methods, you can relax. You can take a breath and go, okay, I didn't damage my baby, right? And then the third
Explain
question.
to parents that one decision or one thing that you make is not going to determine your child's outcomes forever, right? And this is
and I think that's such an important point. So I'll tell you too, we have really good friends who all had babies about the same time we did. And there are a handful of them that were radically different in terms of pretty much every parenting decision. So like my best friend and her and our 2 or 3 of our best friends, they were very schedule driven, like feedings were scheduled. They did, cry it out sleep training. They did all these things, and we were much more follow the baby's lead, like whatever. And here's the bottom line is that our kids turned out awesome and their kids turned out awesome. So I think, especially when you're a new parent, every decision feels like the most dramatic moment where you can either screw up your kid or do it right. And there really aren't very many right and wrongs. And there really aren't, around these decisions, they seem so huge, but really in the scheme of things, they really honestly are small decisions, even this one. So, and at the end, we can talk about what the bottom line of the bottom line is. What's the most important thing that you really should care about? This stuff, it feels so huge, but whatever you decide, your kids will be fine, really, truly.
There's not that many things that are actually important to care about. So I'm excited to look for that.
Yes, there really aren't. There really aren't. In fact, this book originally, I thought might be called Have To's, If You Cans and Forget About It. Like I was going to kind of break it down that way, but maybe that's another book someday. I don't know.
Yes.
Okay. So what about the relationship? Back to your question. What about the relationship between the parent and the child? And again, this gets very complex because not very many studies, and the studies that are out there don't isolate just the crying it out thing. They look at multiple things the parent was doing.
How would you even measure attachment before and after try it out? And also, would it even be past ethical
right
tests?
Well, and the gold standard for measuring a child-parent attachment relationship is done in called the strange situation, and it's for 12 to 18-month-olds. So you can't really, and that's the other problem with the sleep literature is all of it relies on parental report. And what I learned definitively in all my master's and doctoral work is that parental report in research is hugely problematic because parents are actually really terrible objective reporters of their children. I mean, you know this, if you've ever talked to your friend and they're like, oh my gosh, my 2-year-old is a gifted harmonica player. And you're like, they're just blowing into it. Like we are such terrible objective reporters on our own kids. We just
literally the worst people to report objectively.
Exactly. So they would have parents take logs and things like that, but parental report measuring multiple things. So how do you know what's causing the sleep or not? Or, so it's like I said, the state of the research is not, I don't feel that confident in it. I feel like we're just at the beginning of that, And actually, so in terms of the parent-child relationship, which is also a little bit of an answer to the last question, is that one of the studies that was done I thought was so fascinating, and they looked at babies' stress hormones. So they did look at, is this going to be really stressful for babies? Okay, so this is a little bit of the last question that I didn't add. And what was interesting is they found that after about 2 or 3 nights, the babies stopped crying, but their cortisol levels were still high. So what that tells me is a baby that's not crying is not necessarily a peaceful baby. A baby that's not crying but has high cortisol reminds me of what we see in the strange situation when we're looking at attachment, when there is what's called avoidant attachment, where the baby is distressed, the cortisol levels are high, but the baby doesn't reach for the parent or ask for help because that baby has already learned that the way I get the best response from this caregiver is to not have a need that I express here. I'm not saying that that's what's happening. I'm just saying that's what it reminded me of. And so when babies have high cortisol levels, but they've stopped crying, then there's a problem because the baby is in distress and not asking for help. Now, high cortisol doesn't necessarily mean they're in distress, but it's an indicator that they are in a stressed state. So we have to think about stress. So that's where I brought in the stress research as well to look at, there's tolerable stress, which
yes,
is
stress is important. It's not, we're not saying that your baby should never, or child should never have any stress, right?
No, please don't protect them from all the stress of the world. That makes them fragile. If you want your children to be resilient, let them experience some stress with enough support. That's the key.
Yes.
If you're in high stress states with no support, that tolerable stress goes to become toxic stress. So kids can go through really horrible things, even the death of a family member. If they have enough support, it keeps it from being toxic stress and allows it to be tolerable stress, okay? So for some babies, well, that's a whole other thing. I'll get into that in a minute. So here's the problem though. When the babies are in distress and they don't ask for help, what that tells me is they've learned to say, okay, crying's not going to get me anywhere. And so I'm not going to cry anymore, but I'm still having a hard time. And for me, that was kind of the opposite message I wanted my kids to have. Like I had friends who would say, well, I don't want him to think he can call and cry and I'll just come to him. I don't want him to know that like I'm going to be there every time he needs me. And I thought, gosh, that's the exact opposite message I want to give my kids is that, and I know crying is their communication. They can't be like, hey mom, I'm just a little stressed, but I'd rather you be in here. Or no, I'm really upset. You know, we have to read their cries. Okay, so back to the relationship. Okay, about the cortisol study. So what was interesting is because parental cortisol is very tied to our children's. Except that we get that from the signals and the communication our children are giving us. So in this study, even though the baby cortisol levels were high, the parents' cortisol levels were not high because the baby wasn't crying. They didn't have that physiological, psychophysio, neurobiological response that says, oh, my baby's in distress. My cortisol is going to go up so that I can go take care of my baby so then I can feel at peace, right? There's that whole like dance and relationship that happens. And so the parents and the babies were really misattuned in those moments because the parent didn't know that they were in distress. So keep in mind, a quiet baby is not necessarily a baby that's totally at peace, regulated, feeling safe and good. It might be, but it may not necessarily be. Now, one thing I should say is that there are methodological problems with that study. They didn't take baseline cortisol at the beginning. So again, not definitive, this science, but it's something that is something to think about, and it's something that we want to do more research on. So finally, on this parent-child relationship, you know, what some of the studies also say is that the parent-child bond is better later. How they're defining bond is different from how we might think about attachment. Again, back to definitions makes it really hard to study. But it doesn't seem to, according to the research, have a detrimental effect on the parent-child relationship. So again, if you decide to do a cry it out method, there are plenty of other ways to attune to your child. So here's what I would say just in terms of the final like things to think about around this is regardless of if you do sleep training in more gentle ways, like, and I learned about, when I was doing this, I learned about some gentle ways that I wish I had known about, like camping out. I didn't know about camping out, where the parent is basically sleeping in the room, but not next to the child. Like, I would have tried some of those things because my kids were not good sleepers.
Yeah.
I think the key is that regardless of what you do, it's super important to be very attuned and emotionally present and affectionate with lots of touch during the non-sleep hours for everyone, but especially if you're doing cry it out, making sure that you're really giving your kid a lot of predictable repetitions or reps of, when you need me, I'm here for you. And
So
then
really it's about building up their buffer, right? So you can build it up by throughout the day as well. And the sleep. So I actually came to understand crying it out approaches as a stressful life event, basically for babies. What do you think about that?
I mean, it can. This is where we have to go back to the individual baby. So, and I think this is my key thing that I always want parents to walk away with as they're making this decision. And it relates to this question. And that is, there's a huge difference between a baby that is fussing and trying to work it out and in just a little bit of stress, and a baby that is having what I would call an attachment cry, where they are truly in distress, in high levels of stress. And I would say to anyone, regardless of what you choose, no baby should be left in high stress states for long periods of time, period. That, I believe, based on everything I know from lots of different fields of science, is not healthy. I think it absolutely, for those babies, is a stressful life event. So this is where we have to go to individual differences. I know that with my firstborn, who was a very sensitive baby, who, didn't like to be held by very many people, and was, he was a shyer temperament, very sensitive. If I had put him in the crib and let him cry, it would have been, I think, a trauma for him. I actually think it would have been traumatic for him. I think my secondborn, he would have cried really hard. He always made these huge tears that were almost projectile. He had like projectile giant tears. It was the cutest thing. I think Luke would have cried really hard for a minute or two, and then he would have found a way to put himself to sleep, and it would not have been a trauma for him. I don't think it would have been that stressful for him. And my youngest, I'm not sure. It could have gone either way for him. But I think we have to think about the individual child. For some children, it will be potentially traumatic, I think. And those may be those 20% that no matter what you do, just are like, I have to have you to feel safe enough to go to sleep. And then for some kids, they're like, yeah, I didn't like that, but I'm good. So again, paying attention, what you really should be doing is tracking your baby's stress states, and knowing that even if they're not crying, I guess I would say if they're not crying, they're probably not in toxic stress, unless they've gone so far that they've dissociated, but that's a whole other thing. And I don't want to scare parents about that. So, but if a kid is crying and crying and crying, and you can tell, you go in and they are beet red and they're sweaty, and, some of them have vomited, like that is too much stress for a baby for a long period of time. I just really believe that.
Yeah, I agree. And I do talk to parents about listening to the cry so you can determine what you need to do. And I think one of the challenges with kind of cry it out approaches is that rather than listening to the cry, you're watching the clock to decide whether you should go in there. So it's not
to listen. It's so hard. I mean, I think just the fact that I know, like when my kids cried and I couldn't like I had a neurophysiological response. And we see that's clear in the science too, that we are absolutely intricately tied in our nervous systems to each other. And so really like telling yourself like to not listen and not go there, I think the repair happens the very next day. Like, I think it's fine. I don't think it does damage. But for me, that was a big reason I didn't want to do it, is that I feel like my instincts to go to my babies are important information. And I didn't want to shut that off.
Yeah, and it's so important to take the science and also your intuition and your knowledge of yourself, of your baby. Like you said, every baby is going to respond differently, and make those decisions so that you're comfortable and confident, even if you do choose sleep training or crying it out or whatever it is, because you feel like the benefits for your family outweigh the risks. But I think that's essential, and I really like that about your book, is that you're encouraging parents to make their own informed decisions. So the science
Yeah,
is important. Yeah.
it is. And I think that, every family is different too. And one of the reasons, because I didn't do cried out sleep training, and my boys were not great sleepers. They were all great sleepers by the time they were 2. But I was up nursing them a lot in the middle of the night. And honestly, for those years, I was so exhausted, which made me grumpier and less patient with them. And so there's always a trade-off, right? So if I say no to cry it out, I'm saying yes to, I'm going to be a grumpier, less healthy person myself. And so there's always the trade-off. And in our situation, my husband's a professor and he works from home a few days a week. And so I knew like 3 or 4 mornings a week, he could get up with the kids early and I could sleep later. And so that was what it was able for me to sustain it. If we had both had, like, if we were both classroom teachers where we had to be at school at 7:30 in the morning, I don't think I could have done it. It would have been unsafe for me to drive my kids around in the car because I would have been so sleep deprived. So every family has to figure out, does this work? And what are the trade-offs? And I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because there are risks and benefits to every decision we make. And no decision we make is in a vacuum. It's a web of decisions, right? So like the science will say, when babies are the first few months, you should breastfeed on demand or feed them on demand because they might have clusters of developmental growth and cluster feeding. And then the science also, so that keeps you up, right? Like you're up a million times. But the science also says, it's really important for parents to be well rested you can't do both. The science leads us to places where you can't follow all the science. It's impossible. And so all of these decisions impact. So if I decide not to cry it out, maybe I have more marital conflict, which isn't great for my kids, So it's every decision kind of is like more like a web. And we just have to decide what is best in that moment, knowing that 2 weeks later, your kid's in a different developmental phase or another kid has a big need at that time. And it's honestly the parenting thing that we need most a lot of times is flexibility. Just being able to shift gears because the needs, including yours, change a lot from week to week.
And really considering kind of your resources, like you have all this knowledge and information, but also what your resources are, from what you're saying, is going to dictate your ability. So you can't want to like breastfeed through the night and go baby-led and everything, but that requires support from family, from your partner.
Totally.
So it really depends on what each individual family situation is. I don't think there is kind of a one size fits all,
Right.
just anything else. And like you're saying, even if the science says so, you still always have to consider your own risks and benefits and your own situation.
Absolutely.
Even if it was the wrong decision, when you look back at it, you still feel confident because you know why you've made a certain decision. Like that's sharing with, I chose not to do this with my kids, and I feel really good about this right now. I don't know how long later it is right now since I had to make this decision. But you obviously thought it through, and you said, okay, this is what our situation is, and this is why I'm deciding this. So even if you are thinking about kind of the downsides of being sleep deprived or being grumpy and things like that, you still feel confident about it. So there was actually a relevant question about it that I'm losing right now.
While you look for it, I'll just say, I think it's so important to be intentional, like you said, just to be intentional, but it's also okay to just survive. You know what I mean? Like, I want to be intentional about everything, but sometimes I can't even have a moment to think through what I have to decide in that minute because 3 people are hanging on me and the dog has just thrown up and my mom's texting and, it's like, I don't know, everyone just turn on the TV. Like sometimes you just have to survive the moment, and that's okay too. I think I see a lot of really stressed out parents because they're trying so hard to be so perfect. And when they have those moments, they feel like they're really hard on themselves. Mm-hmm. And I just think we have to remind ourselves, this is the hardest job that any human ever does in the universe. And it's really hard. and I'm doing my best, and I'm keep on learning, so my best can get better. And so for the times I'm not my best self, well, that's great that I have my best self those other times. So not to be so hard on ourselves, and please don't be hard on other parents. You know, there's so much judgment. You know, when I had friends who told me about their cry it out, you know, or stories, and some of them I was super jealous. They were like, yeah, he barely fussed for 2 days. And, you know, I was like, oh my gosh, I hate you. You know, I'm so tired. And then other times I felt really judgmental, you know, like I went in and my kid had barfed all over and I feel really bad. And I was like, yeah, you should, you know, like I was judgmental in those moments, but that is not helpful. And it's not good for our own souls too, to think like that. Like, I think we should give as much generosity and love and kindness and help to any parent, especially when they're having a hard time, regardless of if they're doing things the same way you are. You know, we're in this sort of tribe together around walking through this, and really knowing that every family is doing their best for the most part. And so let's help each other and not zing judgment at each other.
Yes, and there are things that you can do to, like you mentioned before, to buffer the effects of any bad decisions or days where you couldn't be the mom or dad or parent that you wanted to be. It's not kind of, if you did this, that's it, all of your efforts are gone. You fill up their cup, or you build up that buffer just as much or more when you're spending all this time trying to build it whenever you can.
Yeah, I know we haven't gotten to your question yet, but I have to remind everybody, you know, and I'm just to be clear, my work on attachment is not the same thing as attachment parenting. Attachment parenting is totally different from what I talk about when I talk about attachment. I'm talking about 50 years of cross-cultural research that applies to mammals, not a prescribed set of approaches. So just to be clear on that, you know, I love a lot of the Dr. Sears attachment parenting stuff. I did a lot of it. But if you do none of those things, like baby wearing, co-sleeping, you know, if you do none of those things, you can still have a child who is beautifully securely attached to you. And you can do all those things and have a child who's not securely attached to you if you're not emotionally responsive and tuned in. So that's why I think it's really important that I separate it. But in the attachment literature, one of the things we look at is Ed Tronick's beautiful work. Some of you may know the still face experiment, where the parent goes completely blank and watches what happens, and the babies become dysregulated really fast when their parent isn't giving them reciprocal, you know, responsiveness just within a few seconds. And what he said is that the most attuned parents are really in tune with their child about 30% of the time. So that gives us a lot of leeway, right? Like, we don't have to be, and we have misses with our kids. Like, there'll be a time, like, I'll give my kid a hard time about something, and I think we're being playful, and it'll hurt their feelings. And so it's a miss, right? I've messed up. And in that moment I can say, oh, I'm sorry, that hurt your feelings. I was trying to be fun and funny with you, but I'm so sorry that didn't feel good, right? So you just make a repair. Or you're checked out, you're on your phone and you're like distracted and you're like, and then all of a sudden you realize it, or they grab your leg or put their face in front between your phone and your face. And then you go, oh, okay. And then you set it down and you look at their face and you make eye contact and you are really present in that moment. So even if we have these ruptures, or a bigger one, like you yell at your kids, and then you go and you say, I'm so sorry, I got mad and I didn't handle that well. Will you forgive me? Can I have a do-over? Whatever it is. When we have those ruptures, as long as we have the repairs, it's actually good and resilience building for our kids.
Yes, that's beautiful. Yeah, so it's important to remember that we try our best, and there's always an opportunity to repair, and it's the repair piece that's more important than what you did unintentionally, and there's always another chance to try, right?
And you can mess up all the time and your kids will still be great.
Yes, exactly. You mentioned that so proponents of sleep training actually cite the negative effects of sleep deprivation, both on parents and on babies. You spoke about it a little bit. So how do you, in your opinion, does poor sleep does have negative effect on learning and functioning, or is sleep?
I mean, it depends on what you mean by sleep deprivation. You know, babies, as you know, are not great sleepers. And so babies typically find ways to get the sleep they need. They typically will nap longer, or they'll sleep a little later in the morning. Or like for me, you know, when my babies would cry, I would go and get them. I would nurse them. They'd go right back to sleep. I'd put them down. And just like they say not to like force babies to eat, that you can really trust babies to eat what they, you know, how much they need to eat at that moment. I think unless there's something significant going on where your child is truly sleep deprived, then talk to your pediatrician. There may be some sleep disorder or something going on. But I think, you know,
you would
babies,
also see it in their functioning, right? It wouldn't just be they're sleep deprived just because they're not getting the hours that your app said or whatever it is.
right? Yeah. My only concern around, you know, sleep deprivation stuff is when it impairs functioning, and they're, you know, babies, they'll fall asleep while they're eating. They'll fall asleep in the car. Like when they're tired, they sleep. But yeah, if your baby seems like they're not learning and they're not functioning, you should absolutely talk to your pediatrician. And that, in that case, it could be a kind of a rarer sleep disorder, but that is not a concern for me at all. I'm more concerned about parental sleep deprivation. I've had parents in my office who were so rigidly following attachment parenting, like the Dr. Sears approach, that their baby's needs were so dominant that they weren't taking care of themselves. And I was truly afraid for them to drive their vehicles with their children. And like, it didn't seem safe. So I think I worry more about parental sleep deprivation. But again, we have to find ways to have support and to have help and to sleep when our baby sleeps. And if you don't have the luxury to do that, or you feel like it's really impacting, you're starting to feel depressed or super anxious, then it might be time to do something different. And I also think that there's a big difference. You know, when I decided I was going to stop nursing in the middle of the night when my kids were, gosh, they were like 18 months or 15 months or something like that. I did it forever.
Very
and
patient, yeah.
I still nurse before bed or in the morning or whatever, but I didn't want to nurse anymore in the middle of the night because I felt like they could sleep through the night and it was disrupting their sleep and mine. I think I'm remembering best my middle son, and he was about 14 or 15 months. And I could have a conversation with him. He could understand some story, and I could say, Mommy's milk is going to be sleeping at night. And if you wake up and need help, Daddy will come and comfort you. But Mommy and Mommy's milk are going to be sleeping at night. And I don't know what degree he understood that, but we would tell the story about that. And so then I would sleep and my husband would get up with him. And I think there's a huge difference between having a baby cry alone in high levels of stress versus being held. And, you know, Luke cried his little head off when he didn't get me, but he was in his dad's arms. He was, you know, and he knew he was safe. And so I think, you know, the goal isn't to, like, we never want our babies to cry. We want to be giving our babies support, right? So when they get a shot or they're hurt, they're crying, it still hurts, but we're holding them. So I think if parents are really struggling with sleep deprivation, they need some help, whether it's from a partner or you have another family member come stay with you for a week or two and just give you some help. Best if that person is an attachment figure that the baby knows. Strangers don't replace parents. We know that from the literature. But I don't really worry about that question. I think there are benefits to sleeping for kids and babies. That's clear. But the opposite of the argument doesn't really hold a lot of weight for me.
Yeah, so their bodies know when they need to sleep, and it's really about us just trusting them that they'll show us and giving them that chance versus making sure and forcing them into sleep, which is when I find that lots of parents get stressed because we're trying to control something that is not controllable because it's a biological process, right?
Yes, I tell parents, like, and I'm kind of a type A, like I like to control things. I have high expectations. I'm super organized. My favorite present ever was a label maker my husband gave me. I really like to be on top of things. But I learned really fast that you cannot control another human being. You can't, especially when it comes to sleep, elimination, going to the bathroom, and eating. Like, you cannot force someone to do those things because they are a biological process. You can pave the way for those things. You can create context and cues around those things, but you cannot force another human being to do any of those things.
Yes, this is beautiful. Thank you. I have one really good question, and then I think we're out of time. But there is a question that says, can you spoil a baby?
Oh, I love that question. Depends on how you define the word spoil. When it comes to, and it's a great word to use because we all know what we mean, but I wish we could find another word. I kind of hate that word because spoil means damage, right? But when it comes to responding to your child's needs, responding to their cues, picking them up, holding them, comforting them, giving them affection, giving attention to them, all of those things, it is impossible to spoil a baby with those things. Where we can go wrong is in whether or not we're setting limits and boundaries. So I actually wrote my dissertation on this, and there's an entry in the bottom line for baby book on discipline, where we're really looking at two separate domains. One domain is about emotional responsiveness and nurture, right? So you can be low on nurture and warmth and emotional responsiveness and affection and all that, or you can be really high on it. And then there's another dimension. So we've got nurture dimension, and then we have the structure dimension. In the literature, it's called the control or demandingness dimension. But as of what we just said about control, I don't usually like to use that word. So you can have high structure, where you have boundaries and limits and rules and expectations, and you explain them to your child, and you expect your child to really abide by, but not obey unequivocally, because you wouldn't want them to obey unequivocally any adult that told them to do something, right? So that can be dangerous for kids. So you can be high on structure and limit and boundaries, or you can be low on them. So you cannot spoil a kid when it comes to the nurture, emotional responsiveness one. It's impossible. And
I hear you saying kid, so it's not just baby, any human, I think.
Absolutely.
Baby, child, right? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially when they become teenagers, you really need high structure, limits, and boundaries that they've been used to, that they've been used to having, and actually boundaries and limits help kids feel safe because they know what to expect. And when their emotions are all over the place and they're having a tantrum, and you go, I'm right here with you. I see that you're so upset, but I can't let you hurt your brother. You're actually providing a little bit of a boundary and a border for them to not cross through that actually helps them feel safer. So we can't spoil them on that at all. But if we don't have boundaries, if we don't have limits, that's where the spoiling can come in. It is not good for kids for us to give in to them repeatedly. It's okay to change your mind. It's okay to give in sometimes. Anytime we're too rigid about anything, it's not good typically. We have to be flexible. But to say, and the way those come together, and what the research says and what I've written about extensively, is that you can say yes to the child's experience and feelings while saying no to the behavior. So you can say, you're so disappointed about getting out of the bath, and you're just mad at mom because you want to stay in the bath. I know, you're so sad about that, as you're lifting them out of the tub. So, this is really about where kids become indulged, is where there aren't expectations or boundaries or limits placed on them. And the research bears that out, is that if you're high on the emotional responsive nurturing and you're also high on the structure, boundaries, limits, those are the best outcomes for kids. And it builds their prefrontal cortex better, et cetera, et cetera. So you can use empathetic boundaries, right? I know you don't want to do this, but it's time to do it. Those
so
kinds
it's not about, even around the sleep, it's not about forever. So if it's not about forever kind of doing everything that they want and need, you can still provide, if you know that they need 2 naps because they're not doing well when they're only having 1 nap, then you're offering them the 2 naps, right?
right.
You offer that kind of environment to help them fall asleep because you know that they need it, or they need to wind down, for example, because if they don't have wind down time, they're not going to sleep, for example. And as the adult, you're the one who would know that for them, but it's up to their body to decide how long to sleep, whether that time would be downtime or sleep time, but you still provide that structure and that support to, okay, you are tired now, so we're going to go wind down and relax or sleep or whatever that might be, depending on the...
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right, is we're creating and facilitating what they need. And we do know best. Yes. I hear of people who allow their, 6-year-old to, go on go visit a couple schools and then decide which school they get to go to. well, you can take your child's opinion and what they liked into consideration, but the child's not thinking about, oh, they have a bilingual program here. You know, they're not holding the complexity of all that information. And a lot of times things that kids want are not good for them. You know, they would rather not get any kind of doctor poking them in any capacity, but they need to be taken care of medically, you know. So we, you know, and those are hard moments for us, but when we can show our kids this is hard, but I've got you and I'm calm and I trust that this is going to be okay, the energy we bring to that has a huge influence on how our child experiences something. If we freak out and we are really reactive and this is going to be so terrible, you know, and right now in the pandemic that we're in, you know, when parents are like, you know, when things are happening around going back to school and or, you know, any decisions that are being made, when parents are freaking out, and of course you're freaking out. Yeah, that's a natural response, but don't do all of your freaking out in front of your kids. You know, when you go to your kids, you have to, you know, you have to say, this is really hard and this isn't what we wanted it to be. And we're so sad about it not being what we want. Or so we're really missing our friends or whatever we're missing out on. And to say, but you know, we're tough. We can get through this. We're going to work this out together. And you share that calm, confident competence. And then in moments when you don't, you go, yeah, sometimes it's really scary, but then I think, and I pause and I talk to my friends, or I talk to my dad, talk to your dad, or, you know, whatever it is. And then I start being a problem solver. So sometimes I have big feelings and then I let myself feel, and then I'm like, okay, how can I be a problem solver? So we can even walk our kids through that process, being authentic, but the way we narrate or present around anything that happens to our kids impacts how they experience it. So we have to keep ourselves regulated.
Yeah, so you really are their leader and they're looking to you to know how to understand something, and while they're developing that capability for themselves, whether that's on a brain level, developmentally, whatever that might be. So as the parent, it's really important that you provide that kind of structure and boundaries and limits, but also nurture, and there's no kind of, you can't nurture someone too much. And that probably includes adults in your family too, like your partner.
Yes.
I think sometimes when we're sleep deprived and we're tired and stressed, it can be harder. But that's not a sign that we necessarily need to withdraw the nurture. It's a sign that we need to meet our needs and find ways to get ourselves to sleep, whatever it is that might be that we need.
Yeah, and I think that's key, and we're really bad at that, especially as moms. But parents in general, but especially moms, we're really bad at that. I'm really bad at it. I work at it constantly, and now that my kids are older, I feel like I have more space for it and more discipline around it. But you have to keep in mind that your capacity absolutely influences your children. And so actually one of the best things you can do for your kids is to take care of yourself. You know, I know I'm really hypocritical as I say that, but, you know, and this is sort of the bottom line of the bottom line, is that what your kids need most from you is you, flawed, imperfect you. And the research clearly shows that one of the best predictors for how well kids turn out is that they have what's called secure attachment with at least one person. And Dan and I wrote about this in The Power of Showing Up, and we talk about the way we facilitate secure attachment is with the 4 S's, helping kids feel safe, seen, soothed, and that over time, when they have enough of those 3 repeated kinds of experiences, they develop that 4th S of secure, which allows them to know and have their brain wired to expect that if they have a need, someone will show up for them. And then over time, they learn how to show up for themselves, how to keep themselves safe and to see and understand themselves and soothe themselves, and to be able to do that in other relationships. So there's this intergenerational impact. And so the key around that, so that's, you know, and so that's really the bottom line I say of the whole bottom line is all these decisions are just decisions. What matters most is that you show up for your kid and that you provide them with secure attachment. That's the most important thing.
More important than sleep, than how they...
Than all of those things. And whether you sleep train or not, your kids can be securely attached to you, right? So this is not, those are not the end all be all questions. They really aren't, even if though they feel like it. But
I am reading that book right now and also highly recommend it. And
which one? The Power of Showing Up?
Yes. And the soothe part is the part that I was that that made me really curious about the whole crying it out sleep training. So it's really, really great to hear you talk about it and really explain it in such a balanced way. And really kind of sounds like the message is really what's important is that you show up, that you're kind to yourself and compassionate to yourself, and that you take the science, but really apply also your knowledge of your instincts, of your baby, of your family, and whatever is going on for you. And actually,
I think one other thing I really wanted to say is that if we really want to provide our kids with what they need most from us, this secure attachment, we have to have people who show up for us.
Yeah.
We need people who help us feel safe and seen and soothed, and to fill our capacity, because doing this work is hard. It's simple to say, okay, well, I'm just going to help my kids feel safe, seen, and soothed. It's a simple idea, but it's hard. And so we just have to make sure that we have people who show up for us and that we show up for ourselves so that we have the capacity to do this work in really important, good ways.
Yeah, so in the first year, you might be looking for those very practical, what to do, how to decide for you. You have no time. And it sounds like your new book is really tackling those topics. You quickly can just go into the topic that you need to know the answer to. And then another thing that you might consider once you're ready, once you're more like a little bit more rested, is diving more into the power of showing up, for example, and understanding, okay, how do I show up for my kid, for my baby, and how do I do those things? So I think those books are going to complement each other beautifully. And I'm just so excited that this book is dedicated to the two babies. Is it for the first year mostly questions, or?
You know, it's mostly focused around the first 12 months, but a lot of the entries, and I was reading it, I just finished doing the audio version, so I just read it cover to cover the last 2 days. There's a lot in there for toddlers too. So, you know, I've got, like I said, a whole section on discipline, and honestly, the sleep stuff goes on. All kinds of things around things that could apply to toddlers too. But yeah, there's stuff in there, you know, around like circumcision and depending on how long you're breastfeeding, there's several entries around breastfeeding. There's several entries around childcare, which are decisions we make into those years. And who knows, I don't know if I'm up for it. I have another book I'm kind of excited about writing next, but maybe I'll do a bottom line for toddlers and preschoolers and school-age kids and teenagers and dogs. I don't know. Bottom line for puppies. I don't know.
Yeah, and this is so important because I feel like this is a population, particularly like under 7, that isn't really well understood still. We have all this knowledge and information and research, but we're still kind of in many ways at the start of it. So I'm really excited to see a book that's really focused on those early, you know, on this early time of babyhood and toddlerhood, and that really just answers all those big questions that you really need to know. And you want it from a reliable scientific basis, but also that encourages you to understand that you need to make decisions for yourself, so that even if it's a wrong decision, you at least know why you made it. So that shame and guilt, it doesn't come up so strongly when we do decisions with confidence, with knowledge, and with empowerment to trust our judgment. So I'm really, really excited. Where can everybody find you and your book?
So my website is tinabryson.com, and there are links there to all my social media. I'm Tina Payne Bryson on Instagram. Yeah, I'm on Twitter and Facebook and all that too, but tinabryson.com is the easiest place to go. And there's tons of free content on there. There's tons of videos and short, you know, I have several things on there about helping kids through the pandemic. So lots and lots of free content for you. And I've been the guest on all kinds of podcasts, including my brand new one, which I just am realizing I almost didn't say because it's brand new. It's my first time to talk about it with someone. It's called Baby in the House. And it's a really fun podcast with a pediatrician, Phil Boucher, who he's got 4 or 5 kids. He's got a lot of kids, and he's a pediatrician. So we have some fun talking through these questions and ideas. So join us also on Baby in the House for podcasts.
That's really exciting. I'm definitely going to check that out. And I think
do an episode on sleep training actually. And he has a sleep train. He's, as a pediatrician, he said he learned that he can't change parents' minds. And so he has 2 programs. He has a cry it out program and a non-cry it out program. And he's, you know, he tries to make the cried out one as, you know, as emotionally responsive and tuned in and gentle as possible. So he and I have a little bit of a difference there. I wouldn't offer that other option, but I think it's smart that he does, because at least you're having a pediatrician guide you through that if you're going to do it. So anyway, it's a really fun matchup. It's fun to have a dad and a mom and an MD and a PhD, and it's a fun combo.
Absolutely. I really want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me. I think this interview is invaluable, and I'm really excited to share it with everyone. So thank you for taking the time. And your book is coming out in September, so luckily we don't have to wait as long as I was worried I would have to wait.
No, and you can pre-order it now, and it'll show up at your house on September 1st.
Perfect. They can pre-order it. Perfect. Yeah. That sounds great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Valerie.